At 4:59 p.m., the office still hummed with the smug confidence of people who thought systems ran themselves. By 5 o'clock, she was gone. One quiet click of heels, one elevator ride, one cardboard box nobody noticed. 36 hours later, executives were staring at frozen dashboards, unanswered supplier calls, and a financial bleed spreading through the company like black ink in water. Somewhere between arrogance and panic, one terrifying question finally surfaced. If anyone could do her job, why couldn't anyone stop the collapse? The first thing people noticed about Evelyn was how calm she always looked. Not happy, not warm, calm. Like a lighthouse standing in the middle of a storm that everyone else pretended wasn't there. For 11 years, she arrived at exactly 7:10 every morning. Same charcoal coat in winter. Same silver travel mug balanced in one hand. Same quiet nod to the security guard downstairs, whose name she somehow remembered, even after 3 management restructures and 2 outsourced reception teams. Nobody important ever noticed that part. Executives noticed louder people. The ones who filled conference rooms with motivational buzzwords and PowerPoint slides glowing blue against tired faces. The ones who used phrases like cross-functional optimization while Evelyn quietly fixed the disasters those same people accidentally created. Again, and again, and again. The operations floor on the 32nd level never slept. Even at dawn, it carried the low electric pulse of a living machine. Keyboards tapping, phones vibrating, giant shipment maps flickering across wall monitors, like nervous systems exposed under fluorescent light. Evelyn knew every artery of it, every supplier chain, every emergency override, every undocumented workaround hidden inside software older than some interns working there. She knew which ports delayed cargo during rainstorms in Singapore, which freight managers lied in emails, which customs officer in Rotterdam always approved forms faster after 2 p.m. local time. Knowledge like that didn't exist in manuals. It lived in scar tissue, but scar tissue is invisible until something breaks. That Tuesday began like any other corporate theater performance. At 9 a.m., the executive strategy meeting started 20 minutes late because Melissa Grant, Senior Director of Global Operations, was still finishing breakfast with the VP of Finance downstairs. Melissa walked into meetings the way luxury yachts enter marinas, slowly, confidently, expecting space to appear around them. Perfect white blazer. Diamond watch. A smile polished enough to belong in magazine advertisements. She carried success loudly. Evelyn carried responsibility quietly. There's a difference. All right, team, Melissa announced, tossing her tablet onto the conference table. Let's make this fast. The giant glass room overlooked the city like a control tower above clouds. Rain streaked the windows in silver lines while assistants rushed through hallways outside, carrying coffee cups and deadlines. Evelyn opened her laptop. 3 spreadsheets, 2 logistics alerts, 1 unresolved supplier escalation from Taiwan, and 27 unread messages marked urgent, normal morning. Melissa tapped her manicured nails against the table. Before we begin, she said casually, HR finalized promotion recommendations. A few heads lifted immediately, like dogs hearing a food bag open. Someone straightened their tie. Another pretended not to care. Evelyn kept typing, because after 11 years inside corporations, you learn dangerous truths. The louder people hope, the quieter disappointment arrives. Melissa smiled toward Daniel from procurement. You'll be happy. Then toward another manager. Congratulations in advance. The room warmed with nervous excitement. And then Melissa finally looked at Evelyn. Not warmly, not cruelly either. Worse, dismissively, like someone glancing at office furniture. As for Senior Process Director, Melissa sighed dramatically. We've decided not to move forward. Silence folded across the table. A few people immediately looked down. Cowards always study notebooks when something unfair happens nearby. Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes from the screen. Not shocked, just tired. "May I ask why?" she said evenly. Melissa leaned back. "Well," she gave a tiny laugh, "that role requires scalable leadership." There it was, corporate language, the silk glove covering a slap. Evelyn waited. Then, Melissa delivered the sentence that would quietly destroy the next 36 hours of everyone's lives. "Honestly, Evelyn, anyone can do your job." The words landed strangely softly. No shouting, no drama. Just casual arrogance sliding across polished wood. Somebody shifted uncomfortably. Rain tapped harder against the windows. Evelyn looked at Melissa for a long moment. Not angry. That almost made it worse. "You believe the process runs itself?" Evelyn asked. Melissa shrugged. "I believe systems should never depend on one person." Technically correct. In the same way, icebergs are technically just floating water. Evelyn closed her laptop halfway. "You're right," she said quietly. Melissa smiled, already victorious. Big mistake, because people often confuse silence with surrender. The meeting moved on, but something invisible had already changed in the room, like air pressure dropping before a storm. For the next several hours, Evelyn worked exactly as she always had. She approved freight reroutes, resolved inventory mismatches, prevented a manufacturing delay in Malaysia before leadership even noticed it existed. At 12:40 p.m., she intercepted an automated purchasing error that would have duplicated a $12 million materials order. Nobody thanked her because nobody even knew it happened. That was the nature of operational excellence. When done perfectly, it becomes invisible, like oxygen, and people only appreciate oxygen when it disappears. Around 3:15 p.m., Evelyn received 3 separate Slack messages asking whether she was doing okay. Interesting, not one executive contacted her. Only analysts, coordinators, the exhausted middle layer of people who actually kept companies alive. She answered all 3 with the same sentence: "Everything is under control." But for the first time in 11 years, it wasn't true. At 4:30, the office lighting shifted into evening mode, softer tones reflecting off glass walls and expensive furniture designed to make overworked employees feel sophisticated while slowly burning out. Melissa passed Evelyn's desk on the way back from another meeting. "You know," she said casually, "don't take this personally." Evelyn kept typing. "I stopped taking corporations personally years ago." Melissa laughed, as if that were a joke. Then she lowered her voice slightly. "You're valuable, Evelyn, but replaceable. Everyone is." There are moments when people unknowingly strike the final crack into a structure already under pressure. This was one of them. Evelyn saved her files, closed every dashboard in precise order, disconnected her charger. Then she opened a drawer few people had ever seen her touch. Inside sat a slim notebook, black cover, no label, 11 years of handwritten operational contingencies, not because policy required it, because experience did. She looked at it for several seconds, then closed the drawer again, left it behind. At exactly 4:58 p.m., she stood. No dramatic announcement, no emotional speech. The office barely noticed. Someone nearby microwaved leftover pasta. A printer jammed in accounting. 2 interns argued quietly about presentation fonts. The Empire still sounded immortal. Evelyn put on her coat. At 4:59, Daniel from procurement hurried toward her desk. "Hey," he whispered nervously, "you're really leaving?" "I always leave at 5. "No, I mean—" He lowered his voice further. "Like, leaving? Evelyn looked toward the glowing operations wall. Hundreds of moving shipments, dozens of countries, millions of dollars flowing every hour like blood through invisible veins. Then she looked back at him. "When people tell you they don't need you," she said softly. Believe them the first time. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. And for the first time in 11 years, Evelyn stepped inside without checking her phone one last time before going home. The doors closed. Upstairs, nobody realized the building had just lost the only person who knew where all the cracks were hidden. And cracks are patient things. They wait. Then suddenly, they become disasters. At 6:12 a.m. the next morning, the first warning alert appeared. Nobody saw it, not really. A red notification blinked quietly inside the logistics monitoring system. Shipment synchronization failure, Southeast Asia cluster, then disappeared beneath newer emails, calendar reminders, and the endless digital snowfall of corporate life. By 7 a.m., the operations floor looked exactly the same as always. Coffee cups, headsets, artificial confidence. The machine still moved, at least from the outside. Melissa arrived wearing another immaculate blazer and carrying the dangerous glow of someone convinced yesterday had strengthened her authority. People congratulated her in hallways. Bold decision. Needed fresh structure. You handled that well. Corporate offices are strange ecosystems. Weakness terrifies people, so they gather around confidence even when it's built on thin ice. Especially then. Melissa smiled through all of it. At 8:03 a.m., Daniel from procurement approached her desk carefully, like a man approaching unstable explosives. "Morning," he said. Melissa barely looked up. "Morning. So, small issue. There's always a small issue." "Well," he swallowed. "Thailand inventory feed stopped updating overnight." Melissa sighed dramatically already. "Did IT look at it?" "Yes. And?" "They said the process override credentials were tied to Evelyn." A pause. Tiny, barely measurable, but real. Melissa leaned back slowly, then reset them. "They tried. And?" Daniel hesitated. "The documentation is incomplete." The words hung in the air awkwardly. Incomplete documentation, every corporation's favorite hidden disease. Melissa waved dismissively. "Fine, escalate it. Simple, efficient, wrong." By 9:40 a.m., supplier confirmations across 3 regions began duplicating themselves inside the purchasing system. Automated replenishment logic started treating existing inventory as missing inventory, which meant the system began buying products the company already owned. Aggressively. Meanwhile, shipping schedules failed to update because the synchronization bridge between procurement and freight operations required manual sequencing every Wednesday morning. A sequence Evelyn had performed silently for 8 years. Nobody knew that, because nobody had ever asked, and Evelyn had never bragged. That was the problem with competent people. They make survival look effortless. At 10:15, the first emergency meeting was called. Melissa entered quickly, irritation already visible beneath her polished composure. "All right," she snapped. "What exactly is happening?" 3 department heads exchanged nervous looks. IT spoke first. "We're seeing cascading failures between purchasing automation and logistics forecasting." "English," Melissa said sharply. A younger analyst cleared his throat. "The systems are talking to each other incorrectly." "Then stop them." "We can't." "Why not?" Another silence. Dangerous this time. Then Daniel finally said it. "Because nobody fully understands the workflow dependencies." Melissa's jaw tightened slightly. "Bull." No one answered. Outside the conference room, rain hammered the city again, turning the skyline gray and distorted like wet watercolor paint. Inside, tension thickened. Someone opened a dashboard on the wall monitor. Numbers flooded the screen. Duplicate material orders, delayed shipments, port congestion risks, vendor escalation notices multiplying by the minute. The machine was still running. But now it sounded wrong, like an aircraft engine making noises passengers aren't supposed to hear. Melissa crossed her arms. "Call Evelyn." Nobody moved immediately, not because they disagreed. Because pride has weight. And everybody in that room could feel it pressing against the table. Finally, Melissa looked directly at Daniel. Now. He stepped outside. The room remained silent except for keyboard clicks and rain. At 10:31, Daniel returned. Well? She didn't answer. Call again. She sent it to voicemail. Melissa exhaled sharply through her nose. Unbelievable. But the word sounded less angry than nervous now. By noon, the problem had spread into Europe. Warehouse routing algorithms began rejecting valid inventory transfers. Suppliers received conflicting fulfillment instructions. Containers scheduled for Rotterdam were rerouted toward Antwerp, then rerouted again. Millions of dollars started moving in circles, like blood trapped inside a failing heart. The operations floor changed atmosphere slowly at first. Conversations became shorter. Smiles disappeared. People walked faster. One manager skipped lunch entirely and started eating dry cereal from a paper cup while staring at shipment maps. Another analyst quietly whispered, "This feels bad." It was bad. Very bad. At 1:45 p.m., the CFO joined the crisis call. Nobody invited him. That's how you know situations become serious. Financial executives appear the way sharks appear when water changes color. "How exposed are we?" he asked immediately. Melissa answered too quickly. "We're containing it." The CFO stared at the screen. "I didn't ask for optimism. I asked for numbers." A younger finance associate finally spoke. "Current exposure estimate is 48 million. The room froze. Then he continued quietly. And rising. Even the air conditioning suddenly sounded loud. Melissa rubbed her temple. How does a synchronization issue become $48 million? Nobody wanted to answer, because the answer was humiliating. The company's entire operational architecture had evolved around Evelyn's undocumented interventions over 11 years. Tiny adjustments, human corrections, invisible stitches holding together a system executives believed was automated. She had become the bridge between incompatible software, unreliable suppliers, unrealistic deadlines, and leadership fantasies. And bridges only become visible after collapse. At 2:20 p.m., Melissa finally called Evelyn herself. Straight to voicemail. Again, no anger now, only pressure. "Leave a message," Daniel suggested quietly. Melissa hated the idea instantly, but she did it anyway. "Evelyn, it's Melissa. We're experiencing some operational disruptions. Call me back as soon as possible." Operational disruptions. Interesting phrase, like calling a wildfire unexpected warmth. By 4 p.m., the COO had been informed. And unlike most executives, Richard Vail did not panic visibly, which made him terrifying. He entered the emergency conference room without hurry, carrying a thin tablet and a cup of black coffee. No assistance, no dramatic energy, just silence, the dangerous kind. Richard looked at the screens for almost a full minute before speaking. "How long has this been happening?" Melissa straightened slightly. "We identified the issue this morning." "No," Richard said calmly. "How long has the failure actually been happening?" Nobody answered. He looked around the room once. People suddenly found spreadsheets fascinating. Then Richard noticed something else. One empty chair. Evelyn's. "Where is she?" Melissa inhaled carefully. "She's no longer with the company." Richard turned slowly. "No longer? Since when?" "Yesterday evening." Another silence, this one heavier than all the others combined. Richard set down his coffee. "And who approved releasing a critical operational architect during infrastructure transition?" Nobody moved, because no one in the room suddenly wanted ownership of that decision. Melissa attempted a controlled smile. The process was not dependent on one individual. Richard stared at her, long enough for discomfort to become fear. Then he asked the question that quietly shattered what remained of the room's confidence. "If that's true," he said softly, "why can nobody run the process?" No answer came. Only rain against glass. Only dashboards bleeding red across giant monitors. Only the growing realization that the company hadn't lost an employee. It had amputated institutional memory. And somewhere far from the building, while executives drowned inside a crisis they didn't understand, Evelyn sat in complete silence beside her apartment window, drinking tea while her phone vibrated endlessly across the table. She never touched it. Not once. Because after 11 years of loyalty, exhaustion finally arrived dressed as peace. And in the tower downtown, panic was just beginning. If the systems failed completely overnight, the number wouldn't stay at 48 million. Not even close. If this story made your pulse rise somewhere between anger and satisfaction, you already know why people stay until they break, and why companies only notice invisible workers after the silence becomes expensive. Subscribe for the next chapter, because the next morning, the COO uncovers something buried deep inside the operation system. And Melissa realizes Evelyn didn't just leave a job behind. She left a choice. At 5:40 a.m. Thursday morning, the operations tower looked less like a corporate headquarters and more like a hospital emergency room after a citywide blackout. Nobody spoke above a murmur anymore. The confidence was gone. Now there was only caffeine, fluorescent lighting, and fear. Large shipment maps stretched across the walls in restless colors. Red delays, yellow warnings, blinking alerts multiplying faster than analysts could close them. Every few seconds, another notification chimed somewhere across the floor. Tiny digital screams. The overnight damage report sat open on the central conference screen. Projected exposure, $190,347,112. Nobody rounded the number anymore. Once losses become that large, precision starts feeling cruel. Melissa stood near the glass wall, holding untouched coffee. Her makeup still looked perfect, but perfection under exhaustion becomes eerie. Like flowers arranged in a burning room, the COO, Richard Vail, had not gone home. Neither had most of leadership. Ties loosened, jackets abandoned on chairs, egos quietly decomposing hour by hour. At the far end of the room, IT teams argued in low voices over server logs, while procurement managers manually called suppliers across Europe and Asia trying to stop automated orders before containers moved physically. Some succeeded, most didn't. The system had momentum now, and momentum is merciless. Richard stood at the head of the table, reviewing reports in complete silence. No dramatic frustration, no motivational speeches, just stillness. The kind powerful people develop after surviving enough disasters to know panic wastes oxygen. Melissa finally broke the silence. "We're stabilizing." Nobody looked at her. Richard continued scrolling. Then he asked calmly, "How many emergency overrides have failed?" An analyst answered carefully, 32. "And how many are tied to undocumented process logic?" Another pause. "Most of them." Richard lifted his eyes slowly. "Most?" The analyst swallowed. "All of them." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the city. Inside, no one moved, because everyone was beginning to understand the same horrifying thing. The company did have documentation. Thousands of pages, flowcharts, policies, training modules, compliance binders thick enough to stop bullets. And almost none of them reflected reality. Reality lived inside Evelyn's head. For 11 years, she had quietly compensated for broken vendor integrations, executive shortcuts, rushed software migrations, staffing cuts, impossible delivery promises, and budget decisions made by people who had never touched operations themselves. Not because she was asked to, because she knew what would happen otherwise. This. Exactly this. At 7:15 a.m., Richard requested full access to Evelyn's archived work accounts. 10 minutes later, an IT manager approached carefully. "There's something unusual." Richard didn't look up. "What?" She maintained a private operational audit trail. Now the room looked up. Melissa frowned immediately. "What does that mean?" The IT manager hesitated. She documented every manual correction she made over the last 8 years. Silence. Then another sentence. She averaged 300 interventions per week. The room physically changed after that. People sat back slowly. Someone muttered, "Jesus." Another executive removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes like a man suddenly aging in real time. 300 interventions. Every week. Tiny, invisible acts preventing catastrophe. Like someone quietly catching knives for 11 straight years, while leadership congratulated themselves on how safe the room felt. Melissa crossed her arms defensively. Why wasn't this escalated before? Nobody answered immediately because the answer was embarrassing. It had been escalated. Repeatedly. Buried in budget requests, ignored in staffing reviews, delayed in future optimization initiatives. Corporate language again. The graveyard where urgent truths go to die politely. Richard finally looked directly at Melissa. She requested additional operational redundancy 4 times. Melissa stiffened slightly. We had budget constraints. Richard nodded once, then asked the question like a surgeon sliding in a blade. And how expensive does the budget cut feel now? No one breathed for a second. The city beyond the glass windows looked cold and distant beneath sheets of rain. Helicopter lights blinked faintly between skyscrapers. Down below, traffic crawled through flooded intersections, while inside the tower, a multinational corporation slowly realized it had mistaken endurance for invincibility. At 9 a.m., suppliers began demanding clarification. Some shipments had been duplicated, others canceled. One manufacturing partner in Malaysia threatened legal escalation after receiving 4 contradictory production directives within 6 hours. Meanwhile, warehouse bottlenecks spread through Europe. Ports became congested. Delivery projections collapsed. Every hour increased exposure. Every failed fix created 2 more failures behind it, like trying to untangle wires underwater. By late morning, even the analysts looked hollow. People stopped pretending they had answers, and something strange started happening across the operations floor. Stories about Evelyn surfaced, quietly at first, then constantly. She once rerouted 6 containers during a typhoon manually. She caught a customs fraud issue before legal even noticed. She worked 72 hours during the pandemic launch. She trained half this department. Nobody had said these things publicly before, because offices reward visibility, not reliability. The loud survive upward, the essential survive silently. Until they don't. At 11:20 a.m., Daniel approached Richard carrying a printed folder. Not emailed. Printed. As if the information somehow deserved physical weight. "What is this?" Richard asked. "Evelyn's unresolved recommendations." Richard opened it. Page after page. Risk forecasts, system vulnerabilities, staffing concerns, vendor dependency warnings, contingency proposals. Most marked reviewed, many marked postponed, several marked non-essential. One sentence had been highlighted in yellow. If operational knowledge concentration is not reduced immediately, a single-point failure event could immobilize global coordination within 24 to 48 hours. The date beneath it was 14 months old. Richard read the line twice, then closed the folder carefully. Very carefully. Melissa's voice came quieter now. She never said it was this serious. Daniel looked at her before answering. "Yes," he said softly. "She did." That sentence lingered in the room long after he stepped away. Because denial is easy when consequences are theoretical. Reality changes the tone. At 1 p.m., The board of directors scheduled an emergency review. Legal teams joined calls. Insurance analysts joined calls. Outside consultants joined calls. The building filled with expensive people arriving too late, and still the systems bled money. At 2:47 p.m., Richard finally picked up his phone himself. The room watched silently. He called Evelyn. 1 ring, 2, 3, then voicemail. For the first time in nearly 2 days, genuine emotion crossed his face. Not anger, regret. He left a message calmly. Evelyn, this is Richard Vale. I owe you an apology, and I believe this company owes you far more than that. Please call me back. No one spoke after he ended the call, because there it was at last. The truth stripped clean of corporate language. Not resource allocation, not role restructuring, not scalable leadership. A human being had carried an empire on exhausted shoulders until leadership convinced themselves the weight was imaginary. And now, the entire structure trembled because she finally put it down. But the worst part wasn't the financial loss. It was what Richard discovered next inside Evelyn's final archived report. At the very bottom, beneath all the risk projections and contingency models, she had written one final line. Simple, calm, almost heartbreakingly polite. When failure finally happens, please do not blame the teams. They were already operating beyond sustainable limits. The room fell silent again. Only this time, the silence felt ashamed. By Thursday evening, the building no longer resembled the polished headquarters featured in investor brochures. It looked hunted. The elegant reception area downstairs smelled faintly of burnt coffee and exhaustion. Delivery boxes of emergency catering sat open across conference tables beside half-dead laptops and tangled charging cables. Somewhere on the 29th floor, an analyst was quietly crying in a restroom stall while answering supplier emails between breaths. Nobody had gone home. Not really. Even those who left returned within hours, pulled back by vibrating phones and the growing understanding that the company was no longer fighting a bad week. It was fighting structural collapse. The operations dashboards now glowed almost entirely amber and red. Entire regions had entered manual processing mode. Warehouses delayed outbound movement, waiting for human verification. Freight carriers demanded immediate financial guarantees before releasing shipments. Trust was evaporating, and trust, once damaged in operations, spreads panic faster than numbers ever do. At 6:30 p.m., Richard convened another executive review. This time the room felt different. Smaller somehow, as if reality itself had compressed the walls inward. No polished optimism remained. No one spoke in motivational slogans anymore. The corporate theater had finally burned away, revealing something raw underneath. Fear wrapped in expensive clothing. Melissa sat unusually quiet near the far end of the table. For the first time in years, nobody watched her when she entered a room. Authority is a strange currency. It disappears fastest during crisis. Richard projected Evelyn's operational audit trail onto the main screen. Thousands of entries, time-stamped, cross-referenced, every invisible correction she had performed to keep systems functional. Manual inventory balancing, supplier trust overrides, regional escalation bypasses, emergency freight sequencing, tiny adjustments holding together billions in global movement. The room stared at the list in silence. It looked less like workflow documentation and more like someone secretly patching cracks in a dam while executives held champagne events upstream. She built a parallel infrastructure, one board member whispered. No, Richard replied quietly. She became the infrastructure. That landed heavily, because everyone understood what it meant. The company hadn't automated resilience. It had outsourced resilience into one exhausted human being and called it efficiency. At 7:15 p.m., legal counsel entered carrying updated projections. Nobody liked the expression on his face. Worst case exposure? He adjusted his glasses. $270 million. Someone cursed under their breath. Another executive leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if numbers that large required physical distance to process properly. The legal counsel continued. And that assumes supplier confidence stabilizes by Monday. If. Tiny word. Massive threat, because supplier ecosystems function on perception almost as much as contracts. Once partners suspect instability, every negotiation becomes harder, slower, more expensive. The company was beginning to bleed reputation now, not just money. At 8 p.m., Melissa finally spoke again. "We need Evelyn back." No one answered immediately, because phrasing matters. Not, "we should apologize." Not, "we failed." Just, "we need her back." Richard noticed it too. His gaze shifted toward her slowly. Interesting choice of words. Melissa's jaw tightened. "Well, we do." Richard folded his hands calmly. "No, we need accountability. Those are different things." The room went still again. Melissa looked away first. Outside the windows, rain had finally stopped, but the city below looked blurred and exhausted beneath wet streets reflecting red brake lights like veins under glass. Somewhere far away, sirens echoed faintly through downtown. Inside the tower, another kind of emergency continued quietly, one built from ego. At 9:40 p.m., Daniel discovered something hidden inside Evelyn's archived folders, a video file, untitled, created 3 months earlier. The room gathered around the conference screen as he opened it. Evelyn appeared sitting at her desk late at night under dim office lighting. No makeup, no performance voice, just exhaustion, carefully held together by professionalism. For several seconds, she simply looked at the camera. Then she spoke. "If you're watching this, it means the dependency failure happened." Nobody moved. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I tried to prevent it, repeatedly." Behind her, the operations floor looked nearly empty, except for glowing monitors and city lights beyond the glass windows. She continued, "The issue isn't that the systems are broken. The issue is that leadership normalized survival mode for so long, people stopped recognizing emergency conditions." Melissa's expression hardened slightly, but she kept watching. Evelyn glanced down briefly, then back at the camera. Processes were never properly stabilized because there was never time. Every quarter became about cost reduction, faster delivery, fewer people doing more work. Several executives shifted uncomfortably because she wasn't exaggerating. She was documenting. There are teams here performing miracles every day while being told they're merely meeting expectations. Silence deepened. Then Evelyn said the sentence that cut deepest of all. "And eventually, when people perform miracles long enough, management starts believing miracles are normal." Nobody in the room looked at Melissa now. Nobody needed to. The atmosphere itself had turned accusatory. Evelyn leaned slightly closer toward the camera. "If this collapse has already begun, please listen carefully." Even through the screen, her exhaustion felt immense, like someone carrying invisible weight for too many years without ever setting it down. Do not punish the analysts. Do not blame middle management. Most of them warned leadership constantly. Richard's face remained unreadable. Then Evelyn added quietly, "They were simply easier to ignore than reality." The video ended. No dramatic music. No revenge speech. Just black screen silence. And somehow, that made it worse, because rage would have been easier to dismiss. Calm truth is much harder. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, one board member exhaled slowly. "How did we let this happen?" Richard answered without hesitation. "We confused endurance with capacity." Simple sentence, brutal accuracy. At 10:30 p.m., the company's external consultants delivered their preliminary assessment. Their conclusion was devastating. Operational collapse had not been caused by Evelyn leaving. Her departure had merely exposed a collapse already in progress. Like removing wallpaper and discovering the wall underneath had been rotting for years. The room absorbed that quietly, because deep down, many of them already knew. This disaster wasn't born in 48 hours. It was built meeting by meeting, budget cut by budget cut, ignored warning by ignored warning, and now everyone sat inside the consequences together. Near midnight, most executives finally dispersed briefly to shower or change clothes before returning. But Richard remained alone in the conference room, staring at the city through rain-streaked glass. Then, he noticed something sitting beside Evelyn's archived files. A small handwritten note scanned into the system, probably overlooked before. He opened it. Only one sentence. "Take care of the people who stayed too long out of loyalty." Richard read it twice, then a third time, and for the first time since the crisis began, the COO understood something numbers could never fully explain. The company hadn't just lost operational expertise. It had lost someone who cared enough to keep saving people who never properly valued her. Meanwhile, across the city, Evelyn finally picked up her phone. 37 missed calls, dozens of messages, voicemail stacking like debris after a storm. She listened to only one. Richard's. Then, she looked out her apartment window at the wet glow of the sleeping city below. Quiet, still. Peaceful in a way her life had not been for years. For a long moment, she said nothing. But somewhere downtown, inside a tower full of exhausted executives and collapsing systems, one question now hung heavier than all the financial projections combined. What if she decided not to come back? Friday arrived slowly, like a bruise surfacing. The city outside the tower moved normally. Trains running, cafes opening, people carrying umbrellas through pale morning fog, completely unaware that inside one glass building, a multinational company was balancing on the edge of humiliation. By 7 a.m., exhaustion had erased hierarchy. Vice presidents slept in conference chairs. Analysts gave instructions to directors. Nobody cared about titles anymore, only solutions. And there still weren't enough of them. The overnight numbers had stabilized slightly, but stabilization inside a crisis is deceptive, like standing in the eye of a hurricane and mistaking temporary calm for safety. The projected losses remained catastrophic. Supplier trust remained damaged. Critical operations still depended on fragile manual intervention performed by people who were already mentally and physically exhausted. The machine was moving again. Barely. But now everyone could hear how violently it rattled underneath. At 8:12 a.m., Richard called another leadership meeting. Smaller this time. No unnecessary executives, no presentation decks, just the people still capable of helping. Melissa entered last. Her confidence was gone now, replaced by the stiff composure of someone realizing consequences have memory. Richard didn't waste time. "We've identified the root failure." Nobody spoke. He continued calmly. The systems did not collapse because Evelyn left. They collapsed because leadership built operational dependence while pretending redundancy existed. Direct, clean, impossible to spin. Melissa folded her arms defensively. "So, what's the solution?" Richard looked at her evenly. "We stopped lying first." The room stayed silent because everyone knew he wasn't talking only about systems anymore. For years, leadership reports had described operations as optimized, efficient, scalable, resilient. But those words had become corporate mythology, repeated so often that executives eventually mistook them for reality. Meanwhile, real resilience had looked like one exhausted woman eating vending machine dinners at 11 p.m. while manually preventing international failures no one else even saw. That was the ugly truth, now sitting fully exposed beneath fluorescent lighting. And ugly truths are expensive. At 9:30 a.m., Richard made a decision that shocked the board. He ordered all non-essential expansion initiatives frozen immediately. Hiring restrictions suspended. Operational staffing review accelerated. Every pending automation shortcut, placed under external audit. Millions in projects paused within an hour. The finance department protested instantly. Richard ignored them. "We are done treating burnout like a business model," he said flatly. Word spread across departments quickly. People noticed, and something unusual began happening inside the building. For the first time in years, employees started speaking honestly. Really honestly. Analysts admitted workload manipulation had become routine. Managers revealed teams had been operating understaffed for years. Regional coordinators disclosed they avoided vacations because no backup processes actually existed. Truth surfaced everywhere at once, like cracks suddenly visible after floodwater recedes, and every truth pointed upward, toward leadership, toward decisions, toward years of prioritizing appearances over sustainability. At 11 a.m., Melissa finally requested a private meeting with Richard. He accepted. The conference room overlooking downtown looked strangely colorless beneath the cloudy sky. Wet glass reflected both of them faintly, two figures sitting across polished wood, surrounded by the quiet ruins of executive certainty. Melissa spoke first. "You're making me the scapegoat." Richard answered immediately. "No, reality is." She looked away briefly, then laughed once under her breath. Tired, bitter. "I built this department." Richard nodded slightly. "Yes, and Evelyn kept it alive." That hurt. You could see it. Not because Melissa was evil. That would have been simpler. She was ambitious, intelligent, competitive, the kind of executive corporations often reward aggressively because results matter more than methods, at least until methods become consequences. And now, consequences sat everywhere, on screens, in reports, in silence. Melissa rubbed her temple slowly. She should have pushed harder. Richard stared at her for a long moment, then asked quietly, "Why is it always the exhausted employee's responsibility to save leadership from itself?" No answer came, because there wasn't one. At 1:20 p.m., Richard finally received a message from Evelyn. Short, professional. Of course it was. "I'm willing to discuss transition support under formal consulting terms. Temporary only." The room changed the moment he read it aloud. Relief spread instantly. Visible, like oxygen, returning after near suffocation. But Richard noticed something others didn't. She hadn't said she was coming back. She hadn't said she missed the company. She hadn't said she forgave anyone. Only formal consulting terms. Temporary only. The language of boundaries built from pain. And somehow, that carried more authority than any executive title in the building. By late afternoon, preparations began for emergency transition negotiations. Legal teams drafted contracts. Finance approved figures they would have laughed at 3 days earlier. Funny how value becomes obvious after absence. Daniel sat quietly watching the chaos from his desk when another analyst approached him. "You think she'll actually help us?" He looked toward the giant operations wall, glowing softly across the dim floor. Then answered, "She'll help the people." Not the company. The people. There's a difference. At 5 p.m. exactly, the elevators opened. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Not dramatically, instinctively. Evelyn stepped onto the operations floor, wearing the same charcoal coat, the same calm expression, the same quiet presence that suddenly felt enormous now that everyone understood what it had truly carried. No triumphant music, no cinematic revenge, just silence. Exhausted employees looked at her the way survivors look at rescue boats appearing through fog. Melissa stood frozen near the conference room entrance. For one brief second, their eyes met. An entire history passed silently between them. 11 years. Missed birthdays. Midnight crisis calls. Invisible sacrifices. Dismissed warnings. One sentence spoken too casually in a glass conference room. "Anyone can do your job." Evelyn broke eye contact first. Not angrily. Just finished. Richard approached her calmly. "Thank you for coming." She gave a small nod. "I came for the teams." Again that distinction. Precise. Intentional. Richard understood. So did everyone else. As they walked toward the central operation screens, analysts straightened in their chairs. People moved aside instinctively, not because of rank, because competence has gravity once people finally recognize it. Evelyn studied the dashboards quietly for less than 30 seconds. Then, she pointed calmly toward 3 different regions. "Stop the automated reconciliation loop." An analyst blinked. "That's causing the supplier duplication?" "It's amplifying it." She pointed again. "Freeze Rotterdam, rerouting." "The port latency assumptions are outdated." Another pause, another command. "Who approved concurrent inventory sync during vendor instability?" Nobody answered immediately. Evelyn sighed softly. "Never mind, we'll fix it first." And just like that, the room changed. Not solved. Changed. Because panic had finally encountered clarity. For the next several hours, she moved through the collapse with eerie precision, isolating failures, redirecting teams, simplifying workflows, restoring order piece by piece like someone untangling knots nobody else could even see. No theatrics, no cruelty, no revenge. Which somehow made her impossible to ignore now. Around 9:40 p.m., one exhausted junior analyst quietly stopped her near the printers. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn looked up gently. "Sure." "Why did you come back after everything?" The operations floor hummed softly behind them while rain began tapping the windows again, high above the city. Evelyn considered the question for a moment, then smiled faintly. Not happy, not sad, just honest. "Because good people were drowning inside bad leadership," she said quietly, "and they didn't deserve to sink with it." The analyst stood speechless. Evelyn picked up another stack of reports, then walked back toward the glowing operations wall, where alarms still blinked across continents, waiting for someone who understood how fragile systems and people really are. And for the first time in years, the company finally did.